So today, I am going to talk to you about one of my favourite haunts to visit in England, and that is Hampton Court Palace. It is an absolutely stunning example of Renaissance architecture set on the River Thames just southwest of London. Not only is it stunning to look at, but it also comes with its fair share of ghost stories. So what is Hampton Court Palace and who did it belong to? It is a very rare example of Tudor palaces, as many no longer survive. But the origin of Hampton Court goes back centuries before its current structure. Its first mention was in the Domesday Book of 1086, when it was recorded as a manor house owned by Sir Walter de St Valery. His grandson, Reginald de St Valery, donated the estate to the Knights Hospitaller of the Order of St John of Jerusalem in 1236, who it remained in the possession of for almost 3 centuries. Thomas Wolsey, the Archbishop of York, purchased the land in 1514, and at the time of the purchase, the property consisted of some residential buildings, farm buildings, and a chapel. For the next 7 years, Wolsey worked on turning the buildings into a lavish Renaissance palace, fit for a powerful cardinal of his standing, as a friend and confidant to King Henry VIII, who was one of the most powerful men in the country. In 1528, Wolsey's luck and favour with King Henry VIII was running out, and as a last-ditch attempt to win back the king's trust, he gave Henry the palace as a gift. Sadly, this did little to appease the king's anger at Wolsey's inability to secure an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Wolsey was officially stripped of his government titles, and 2 years after giving the palace to Henry, he was accused of treason, but mysteriously, he died on his way to London to face those charges. It didn't take long for Henry to turn Wolsey's palace into something much grander, fit for a king and his huge entourage of staff and members of court. Hampton Court was a modern marvel of its time and naturally became a favourite of the king, and he did spend a lot of time there. It had easy access into London with the River Thames on its doorstep, but it was still in a secluded enough part of the country at the time that it probably felt a world away from the putrid London town and the old drafty accommodation that the royals used while visiting the capital. The palace was where Henry wanted to enjoy his private life with his beloved wife Anne Boleyn at his side. The palace was adorned with H and A decorations, the letters intertwined in what's called a lover's knot to show their love for each other. Unfortunately for Anne, this was a short-lived romance, as she was beheaded in 1536 for adultery. Henry demanded that all memory of Anne be erased from the palace, and this was seen to straight away. However, there is one place where Anne still has a presence. If you find yourself at the palace and you happen to stand under a particular gatehouse and look up at the ceiling, you can see one decoration that's still there, H and A intertwined. This particular gatehouse is known as Anne Boleyn's Gate. Although the marriage with Anne Boleyn had not ended too well, Henry didn't take long to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour, with Henry proposing to her the day after Anne's execution and then being married 10 days later. Jane Seymour is seen as the love of Henry's life, completely the opposite to Anne, who was dark in complexion with brown hair and brown eyes, while Jane was fair with blonde hair and blue eyes. And while Anne had been fiery and would stand up to Henry, Jane was seen as quiet and demure and the obedient wife. When Jane became pregnant, it was Hampton Court that became her place in confinement, as every pregnant noble lady was expected to endure. She laboured for 2 days and 3 nights until she gave birth to the future Edward VI, Henry's longed-for son, at 2 a.m. on the 12th of October, 1537. Edward was christened on the 15th of October in the palace chapel while his mother lay dying in the birthing bed, and she died not long after on the 24th of October. It is not known what killed her, but most agree it was due to an infection she caught during the birth. Jane was the only one of Henry's wives to receive a queen's funeral, and she was buried at Windsor Castle in St George's Chapel. When Henry died 10 years later, he was buried beside her as he had always requested. Henry was distraught when Jane died and wore only black for the next 3 months, but he would eventually marry again to Anne of Cleves 2 years later, under pressure from his court, which once again, this marriage did not end well. 4 years after the death of Jane, Henry was visiting Hampton Court with his then 5th wife, Catherine Howard, a young girl of around 15 who he was absolutely smitten with. It was at Hampton Court, while praying in the chapel, that he was given a letter with the revelation that his new wife had been having an affair with one of Henry's courtiers and a distant cousin of hers, Thomas Culpeper. On finding out this news, Catherine was ordered to be confined to her rooms at the palace for a few days until she could be taken to the Tower of London. Legend says that Catherine managed to escape her rooms one time and run down the galleries screaming for Henry's forgiveness and mercy, only to be dragged back to her room to await her fate. She was later executed at the Tower of London on the 13th of February 1542 and was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, next to Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. After Henry's death in 1547, Hampton Court became just another palace in the catalogue of properties owned by subsequent kings. It grew more and more neglected as the time went on and was just seen as an outdated residence. It was only during the reign of William and Mary in 1689 that it was agreed something needed to be done. After being inspired by the Palace of Versailles, the plan was to slowly demolish the old-fashioned Tudor palace and rebuild it in a more Baroque style, according to French fashion at the time. Half of the Tudor palace was destroyed and rebuilt before Mary died in 1694, and William lost all interest in the project, which is how you will see the palace today, half Tudor and half Baroque. 2 palaces in one. It was also at Hampton Court in the gardens that William fell from his horse and later died from his injuries at Kensington Palace in 1702. After the death of William, the palace once again became just a countryside residence that didn't attract much attention from many monarchs. A few dabbled in some redecoration, but no major renovations were taken up, and it wasn't used as a main residence by royalty ever again. In the 1760s, the palace started to be used for grace and favour residents, people who were rewarded with rent-free accommodation for their services to the crown. This was a tradition that has continued up until the present day. Queen Victoria opened the palace to the public in 1838. It has received millions of visitors every year since then and is now part of the charity Historic Royal Palaces, who have the head office within the walls of the palace. With so much history within its walls, is it any wonder that tales of ghosts are so prevalent here? Since Victorian times, a period known for their obsession with the dead and their ghosts, stories of screaming phantoms and apparitions within the palace have thrilled and chilled us. And every Halloween, the palace brings these stories to life and let the ghosts roam the halls once more. Probably the most famous story is that of poor Catherine Howard, whose ghost can still be seen running and screaming after Henry as he leaves the chapel after prayer. The gallery is now known as the Haunted Gallery due to her constant pleas for mercy before being dragged back to her room. In 1999, 2 female visitors apparently fainted in the exact same spots in the gallery on 2 separate tours from each other. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, is also said to haunt the palace, near her rooms where she died giving birth to Henry's longed-for son. A pale figure has been seen on the silver stick stairs which lead up to her room, carrying a lit candle on the anniversary of her son's birth. Some say she can be heard humming lullabies to her long-lost baby, while others say she looks forlorn as if she has lost something. While she may have been buried in Windsor Castle, her heart was buried within the chapel at Hampton Court. Could it be that she is looking for this? Hampton Court even has its own Grey Lady. This is thought to be the ghost of Sybil Penn, who was the servant to 4 subsequent Tudor monarchs and was the wet nurse to Edward VI. She had helped nurse Elizabeth I through smallpox, but whilst the Queen recovered, Sybil caught the disease herself and died. In 1829, Hampton Church, where Sybil was buried, was demolished, and according to reports at the time, the tomb was irreverently disturbed and her remains scattered. Immediately after, strange noises were heard through a wall in the southwest wing of Hampton Court, much like the sound of somebody spinning thread. The wall was broken down and an unknown room was discovered in which there was an old spinning wheel. The oak boards were worn away where the treadle struck the floor. The idea prevalent at the time was that because of the desecration of her tomb, she had returned to the room she had occupied in life. Sybil Penn's form, in a long hooded robe and similar in appearance to her effigy on her tomb, was first reported seen by a sentry in the 1890s, and since then a grey figure has been seen walking through the state apartments and the clock court. In the campanile, above Henry VIII's astronomical clock, is the oldest thing at Hampton Court. Older than the clock itself and older than the Cardinal's palace, the bell that strikes the hours. It bears the initials TH for Thomas Harries, a London bell founder, and the date 1479. When Anne of Denmark, wife of James I, died in 1619, the clock struck the hour and stopped. The legend has persisted ever since that whenever one of the older residents died, the clock strikes at that moment of death, and then stops. In 1871, while digging up Hampton Court, 2 male skeletons were discovered under one of the cloisters. It is thought they were royalist victims killed by parliamentarians during the Civil War and buried quickly in shallow graves, which were then covered up during the large-scale renovations of the palace. While this case was intriguing enough, it was made all the more interesting when a Grace and Favour resident, whose apartment was close to where the bodies were found, commented that once the bodies had been reburied respectfully, the banging and the knocking that she had heard constantly on her walls had ceased. She had moaned for years about the racket, but no one had believed her. More recently, in October 2003, CCTV footage at the palace captured a fire door flinging itself open on one occasion, and then the next day, a ghostly figure promptly closing it. The figure can be clearly seen in period clothing, and a lot of skeptics have shrugged it off as being one of the many actors that the palace hires to bring the history of the palace to life for tourists. However, no one has come forward to say it was them, and as far as the palace is concerned, there were no actors working that day. It still remains a mystery as to who the phantom figure could be. Are there any historical houses or ghost stories you would like me to dig into further? Leave a comment below and let me know which is your favourite spooky tale. If you enjoyed this video, then please don't hesitate in giving it a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. You can also sign up to my Patreon or Ko-fi for exclusive content. Head on over to the links in the description of this video for more information. Thanks for watching.